idea of amulet and protection, presumably in this case. Now, earth from a grave as an activating factor. In fact, in several parts of Congo country, the grave itself is called an nkisi. And you might remember, I think I mentioned it last time, that in several places the ruler is considered an nkisi because he is so medicinally packed by the time he takes the throne that in effect he himself is medicine. Well, this is an early 20th century showing several Congo graves, each one delineated by a jumble of materials. So there's one here in the front, one in the back, one off to the left. They are covered with the domestic items of the deceased, the dishes that he used to eat from, the basins he used to wash with, other utensils. They cover the grave. Now the grave is outside the community. Now that may seem obvious to you because our graves are outside the community in general, but that's not true in, say, Cameroon. People of status are buried under the floor of their bedroom in many parts of West and Central Africa, but not for the Congo area. The graveyard is in a distinct place outside the village. And that is because the power of the dead is considered to be strong, and you don't want them lingering around the house. You want them properly placed. And by putting their personal goods on the grave, you're in essence fixing them there. Around the graveyard, there might be other kinds of things as well. Here on some dead limbs, you can see porcelain bowls and plates reflecting, keeping them, in a way, confined to the graveyard. And here, these are grave houses from the early 20th century that are placed over graves, and they have plates on the outside, again, reflecting evil and confining the deceased to the graveyard until such time as earth from the grave might be needed for an nkisi. A diagram of an early 20th century grave. One factor is you can see the border, the layout of where the body is in Congo graves. Here, upside down bottles have created a border. We've got a cooking pot, different kinds of dishes, a jug. Here on the right, a neglected one, you can see a bottle and a jug, and you can also see a figure. This is a figure carved out of stone, and I've already mentioned to you how rare stone is as a sculptural material in Africa, not just Central Africa, but in Africa in general. The only stone we've seen used so far are the Akwanchi figures, those stone figures that we saw amongst some of the Ajagham groups. And this is the only other place we're going to see stone sculpture in Central Africa. It's only one small subgroup of the Congo that have this stone. The area where the stone sculptures are found is amongst the Mboma people, M-B-O-M-A, who are in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The stone sculptures apparently date from the 19th century. They don't make them anymore. Whether some of them are older than that, it's hard to say because, of course, we can't scientifically date stone. But they are interesting images. Some show references to Christianity, as you can see on the left, with a Christ who is bound not with nails but with chains around his neck and arms, two supporting figures, and he's standing on the ground. So it's an unusual interpretation, possibly not Christian despite the reference to the crucifixion. And here on the right with a cross around the neck. You'll notice this is an unusual work in both of them, in fact, in that they're not frontal. This one, the head is tilted. Here, the head is completely turned to one side. And yet these are, this one at least, because he is wearing that fiber cap, is definitely a representation of a ruler. And certainly there aren't enough of these sculptures to indicate that they are anybody but members of royal families. They're not, heavy on the ground or anything. Hieratic scale showing in both of these examples with the deceased larger than the others. Now, why is the head turned on the right? It only happens in grave sculptures in this area. Now, we don't really know the answer because people don't make them anymore. We have 4 more examples here, 2 which do seem to be Christian because we have presumably the deceased praying at the foot of the crucifix, and here a ruler chewing on one of those judicial roots, as well as another figure who is in a very contorted position with his head to one side. These are made of soapstone. Soapstone is a very soft stone and one which can be carved with wood carving tools. So they aren't quite as realistic as the wooden sculptures in their facial anatomy, or the rest of their anatomy for that matter, because it is a slightly harder material. And the contorted position, sometimes it's referred to as a mourning position, but frankly, they don't seem to know the details because no other sculptures take on that form. Here, 2 more stone sculptures. The ruler with his head resting on his hand. The ruler because of the cap, and also because of the prestige of these stone sculptures, which after all were permanent, something that's not very common in Kongo sculpture. Again, that's a gesture supposed to indicate thoughtfulness, melancholy, etc., because of grave. Some of them do depict women, such as the example on the right. Now, that's in a very different style. It's not a freestanding sculpture, it's in high relief, and we are seeing the woman with a child on one knee, much like the maternity figures. And of course, it is through having children that the family of the matrilineage is increased, and therefore for a royal woman, especially one who had had many children, she would have been honored by one of these. The facial style is quite different. Again, the face has been turned, which is a gesture whose meaning is somewhat obscure. You might remember when we looked at the cross-legged figures of women and children, I said some we knew had been used in fertility contexts, but others may have been used in grave contexts. In fact, in some parts of Congo land, there were small temporary shelters set up over the grave, and some of them definitely did use wooden figures. They were protected from the elements. The stone sculptures like this, however, these Mboma-made sculptures, were out in the open. Now, the idea of a sculpture on a grave, you don't find it in most of Africa until the 20th century. And when you find it, it is usually the result of Christian influence, missionary influence, where some kind of gravestone was put up. These too may be the result of missionary influence, but a much earlier one. There are other things besides the deceased's domestic utensils or those Mboma sculptures that can end up on graves. One type of object that's sometimes seen are these terracotta memorial cylinders. They are made by men. Even though women make most of the pottery amongst the Congo, men make these grave pieces of pottery. They're not really pots in that there is no solid bottom. They're cylinders because offerings were poured into them and then they would go directly into the earth over the grave. Some have figurative elements like the one on the left. Others are purely geometric, and you can see some of the patterns we've seen in textiles or in scarification. Certain ones have openings, and these have been interpreted as referring to different stages of death, of life, etc. The ladders leading, or not ladders, but staircases on the left leading from one level to another. When we talk about death, before we get to the burial, there is the idea of how to prepare the body and the kind of funeral. We're sort of moving backwards from the grave here. What you're seeing here is an 18th century image of a royal Congo burial. You can see how many people are involved. Of course, it's a state funeral that they're on the way to. But you can see that they are pulling a cart with wheels, and there are carved figures on it and flags, and this diamond pattern. Diamond patterns are very common amongst Congo. What this is that Congo cosmogram I showed you, the cross inside the circle. It can sometimes not be a circle, but rather, since the 4 points are what's important, the diamond. So when we see that, we're seeing references to the cycle of life. Very appropriate imagery for a funeral. This construction holds the body. Now look how big it was. That's because the body was wrapped in hundreds of mats and cloths before burial back in the 18th century. And although this is not an 18th century mat, it's a early 20th or late 19th century funeral mat. And you can see they are carrying a coffin, and it has one large and many small references to the 4 moments of the sun, or the 4 moments of life and death, the cycle of life. And we are seeing these individuals carrying a coffin, or a corpse, rather, a wrapped corpse for burial. And this is a burial mat. Here, another burial mat that we already saw. Again, we've got a diamond shape, diamonds within diamonds. So many of these very fine mats expressly made for funerals, as well as cloths. And for that burial of the king, the description in the 18th century said, talked about the mats, it talked about hundreds of cloths and cottons and imported silks. So very fine materials for this all-important burial of a king. This is an early 20th century image. So no more of those huge king burials, but this is an important person. What we have here is a corpse that is wrapped in lots of mats and cloths until it becomes a colossal bundle, after which it will be buried. And here, another early 20th century work, a carpentered coffin. Very large example. And in each of these little sort of window panes, almost, these set-in painted panes, is again a diamond, a reference to this cycle of life, and that the deceased will be reincarnated. Now, I want to show you 2 traditions that have to do with preparations of this sort, but in human form, not just shapeless bundles. They both take place in the Republic of Congo, not the Democratic Republic of Congo, but those Congo that live over the border. The first batch of people we're going to take a look at are the Bwende. They're a subgroup of the Congo, B-W-E-N-D-E. The Bwende wrap a human being in cloths, but instead of it being a shapeless bundle, it is encased, and you can see how big these are. The body is encased inside a human-shaped cloth sculpture. They are called Niambo, N-I-O-M-B-O, N-I-O-M-B-O. A male figure on the right being taken to the grave site, a female figure on the left, made out of cloth that is either red already or dyed red. Now look at the gesture of the arms. One hand up, one down. Remember those royal swords that had that very same gesture? It's a reference to the world of the living and the world of the dead. The ancestor that is being buried is on the border between those worlds. They can intercede for the living in the world of the spirits. And because a body is inside, the proportions of these are rather unusual. The head small in proportion to the colossal body. The heads were often made ahead of time in this region, sometimes when the person, that would always be a distinguished person, were still alive. These are royals. You can see they've got that royal cat, female here, male here, and there are sometimes painted designs on the body as well. And these figures were certainly used in the early 20th century, and we have a big funeral in which this royal is celebrated for several days, and then a feast is given. The figure is carried throughout the town, and there's a big procession, then taken to the grave and placed within. Here are two heads that either were never attached to the figure or were detached at some point afterwards. You can see the red cloth on the left. Red is a border color. You know, it is the color of life, but also the color of death. So birth and death themselves both associated with red. We have more of a whitened example on the right. And you can see the reflective material still used in the eyes of either. This is an early 20th century one. They don't file their teeth now and haven't for a long time, but that's shown here. The marks under the eyes are not scarification. They are meant to be tear tracks as the deceased mourns leaving their family. A male here on the right, that's a cloth beard. Here another female view, and you can see the ungainly, to some extent, proportions. So the breasts are carefully depicted in this sewn costume. Then neighboring the Bwende is another group a little further north, the Bembe, B-E-M-B-E. And I'm going to show you not only Bembe cloth sculptures, but Bembe wooden sculptures. The Bembe are a Kongo subgroup, but they are really on the border. They're a little bit different in their wood carving style, but you can see an overlap in these ideas, certainly about death and burial.